The Apache helicopter crouched on the tarmac like a predator waiting to strike, its twin engines ticking as they cooled in the desert heat. Fuel vapors shimmered in the air around the gunship's sleek frame, mixing the acrid smell of aviation gas with the dust and sweat that defined Fort Carson's flight line. Staff Sergeant Maya Chen moved beneath the aircraft's belly with practiced efficiency, her movements precise and economical as she guided the fuel hose into the main tank. To the cluster of pilots lounging near the operations tent, she was invisible, just another ground crew member in stained coveralls, another face they'd never bother to remember. What they couldn't see was the way her eyes swept the helicopter's weapon systems with the attention of someone who had once sat behind those very controls, or how her right shoulder carried a patch that had been carefully positioned to stay hidden beneath her uniform sleeve. A patch that belonged to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, a patch that represented the most classified missions American forces had ever flown. And in exactly 47 minutes, when Brigadier General Marcus Webb arrived for his surprise inspection, that hidden piece of fabric would change everything, because some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried, and some heroes are too legendary to remain anonymous. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight line as Maya completed her pre-fuel inspection checklist. She had been at Fort Carson for exactly 3 weeks, transferred in from what her paperwork claimed was a routine logistics rotation from Fort Campbell. Her service record was clean, unremarkable, a fuel systems specialist with 8 years of steady, unspectacular service. Nothing in those files mentioned the nights she'd flown NOE missions through Taliban-controlled valleys, or the classified operations that had earned her a call sign whispered in reverence among Special Operations pilots, Ghost Rider. The other members of the ground crew had tried to include her at first. Sergeant Rodriguez had invited her to poker night. Corporal Williams had asked if she wanted. The Apache helicopter crouched on the tarmac like a predator waiting to strike, its twin engines ticking as they cooled in the desert heat. Staff Sergeant Maya Chen moved beneath the aircraft's belly with practiced efficiency, guiding the fuel hose into the main tank while carefully keeping her right shoulder angled away from the cluster of pilots lounging near the operations tent. What they couldn't see was the patch hidden beneath her uniform sleeve, a patch that belonged to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, carrying secrets that could change everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight line as Maya completed her pre-fuel inspection checklist. She had been at Fort Carson for exactly 3 weeks, transferred in from what her paperwork claimed was a routine logistics rotation from Fort Campbell. Her service record was clean, unremarkable, a fuel systems specialist with 8 years of steady, unspectacular service. Nothing in those files mentioned the nights she'd flown NOE missions through Taliban-controlled valleys, or the classified operations that had earned her a call sign whispered in reverence among Special Operations pilots, Ghost Rider. The other members of the ground crew had tried to include her at first. Sergeant Rodriguez had invited her to poker night. Corporal Williams had asked if she wanted to grab lunch at the commissary, but Maya's responses were always polite, brief, professional. She showed up before dawn, worked through her assignments with mechanical precision, and disappeared as soon as her shift ended. To them, she was just another quiet transfer who kept to herself. They had no idea that every Apache she serviced was being examined with the eyes of someone who had once piloted these same aircraft through some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth. Her hands moved over fuel connections and safety systems with the familiarity of a pilot, not just a technician. The way she checked weapon mount points, tested hydraulic lines, verified avionics systems, it was the thoroughness of someone who understood that in combat, a single overlooked detail meant the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. Chief Warrant Officer Jake Morrison was the first to notice something different about her work. Morrison had been maintaining rotary aircraft for 15 years, long enough to spot the difference between someone who learned procedures from a manual and someone who understood them from experience. He watched Maya one morning as she performed what should have been a routine fuel system check, noting how her inspection pattern followed the exact sequence a pilot would use during a pre-flight walk-around. "You handle that bird like you've flown her before," Morrison said, approaching as she finished connecting the grounding cable. Maya's hands never paused in their work. "Just follow the checklist, Chief." "That's not a checklist sequence," he pressed gently. "That's pilot protocol." She gave him a small, unreadable smile. "Good habits travel." Morrison didn't push further, but something in her response stuck with him. Good habits travel. It was the kind of answer someone gave when they couldn't tell the whole truth but wouldn't lie outright either. Captain Lisa Hartwell, the unit's maintenance officer, had also begun paying attention to Maya's work. Not because of any problems, quite the opposite. Every aircraft Maya serviced came back from missions with glowing pilot reports. Fuel systems running cleaner than spec, hydraulics responding smoother than usual. Small improvements that individually meant little, but collectively painted a picture of someone who understood these machines at a deeper level than most ground crew ever achieved. "Where did you train?" Hartwell asked one afternoon, reviewing Maya's work logs. "Standard MOS school, at Fort Lee," Maya replied, not looking up from the maintenance manual she was updating. "Must have been some school. These efficiency ratings are the best I've seen in 5 years." Maya simply nodded and continued writing. But Hartwell caught something in her peripheral vision, the way Maya unconsciously adjusted her posture when discussing the helicopters. The slight straightening that spoke of command presence quickly suppressed. The first real hint of Maya's true background came during an unexpected maintenance emergency. An Apache had returned from a training mission with what appeared to be a catastrophic hydraulic failure. Warning lights blazed across the dashboard, and the pilot had barely managed to land safely. The entire maintenance crew gathered around the aircraft, running diagnostics and checking systems. Maya stood back, observing the troubleshooting process. As technicians pulled panels and traced hydraulic lines, she watched their methodology with the patience of someone who already knew what they would find. When they finally located the problem, a severed hydraulic line that should have caused complete system failure, their confusion was obvious. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Sergeant Rodriguez. "With this kind of damage, there's no way the pilot should have maintained control." "Emergency backup system," Maya said quietly from behind them. The group turned. "What?" "The 64 Delta has a secondary hydraulic circuit that's not in the standard manual. Military modification. If you know how to activate it manually, you can maintain enough pressure for emergency landing." The technician stared at her. Rodriguez frowned. "That's not in any maintenance documentation I've seen." "It's not in maintenance docs," Maya replied calmly. "It's in the pilot's emergency procedures handbook. Classified supplement." The silence that followed was heavy with questions no one quite knew how to ask. How did a fuel technician know about classified pilot procedures? How had she identified a system modification that wasn't in their reference materials? Chief Morrison studied her carefully. "You seem to know a lot about pilot procedures for someone who works ground crew." Maya met his gaze steadily. "I read a lot." But Morrison had been around long enough to recognize the careful non-answer of someone with a classified background. The way she'd identified that backup system, the precision of her terminology, the confidence in her voice when discussing emergency procedures, it all pointed to hands-on experience, not book learning. Word of the incident spread quickly through the unit. The quiet fuel tech, who somehow knew more about Apache emergency systems than most pilots. Conversations became more cautious around her. Not hostile, but aware. The easy dismissal of her as just another ground crew member was replaced by curiosity tinged with respect. Maya seemed oblivious to the changed atmosphere. She continued her routine. Arrive early, work methodically, leave quietly. But those paying close attention noticed other things. The way she instinctively ducked when helicopters passed overhead, a reflex born from years of rotor wash. how she always positioned herself with clear sight lines to exits, operational awareness that never fully switched off. The unconscious habit of checking her six whenever she moved between aircraft. 3 days after the hydraulic incident, Captain Hartwell found Maya working alone on a night shift, performing what appeared to be routine maintenance on an Apache that wasn't scheduled for service. The aircraft's engine cowlings were open, and Maya was deep in the turbine compartment with a flashlight and a set of tools that definitely weren't standard issue. "Working late, Sergeant?" Maya's head emerged from the engine bay, her expression calm despite being caught doing unauthorized work. "Preventive maintenance, ma'am. Noticed some irregularities in the turbine inlet temperature readings during today's flights." Hartwell stepped closer, examining the exposed engine. "I don't see any work orders for this aircraft." "No, ma'am. But the T-700 engines on these birds have a tendency toward compressor blade deposits that don't show up on normal diagnostics. If you know what to look for, you can catch problems before they become critical failures." The explanation was technically sound, but it raised more questions than it answered. How did a fuel technician know about T-700 engine maintenance procedures that were typically handled by specialist mechanics? And where had she gotten the tools she was using, precision instruments that weren't part of standard ground crew equipment? "Sergeant Chen," Hartwell said carefully, "your knowledge base seems extensive for your listed MOS." Maya continued working, her movements sure and practiced. "Cross-training, ma'am. Always believed in understanding the whole system, not just my part of it." "Cross-training where?" For the first time, Maya's hands paused in their work. "Various assignments, ma'am. Picked things up along the way." It was another careful non-answer, but Hartwell was beginning to understand that Maya's evasiveness wasn't disrespect, it was operational security. The kind of caution that came from years of missions where the wrong word to the wrong person could compromise not just operations, but lives. As Maya reassembled the engine components, Hartwell noticed something that made her breath catch. When Maya reached for a particular tool, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing the edge of what looked like a unit patch on her right shoulder. In the dim hangar lighting, Hartwell couldn't make out details, but the distinctive shape and colors were unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around special operations units. Before she could get a better look, Maya had adjusted her sleeve and moved to close the engine cowlings. "Should be good to go, ma'am. Recommend test flight tomorrow to verify turbine temps are back within spec." "I'll schedule that," Hartwell said, still processing what she'd glimpsed. "Sergeant, how long did you say you'd been working ground crew?" Maya's smile was small and tired. "Long enough to know when to fix things quietly, ma'am." As Maya gathered her tools and prepared to leave, Hartwell found herself watching every movement with new attention. The confidence, the technical expertise, the careful answers that revealed nothing while saying everything. It all painted a picture of someone whose real story was buried deep beneath an unremarkable service record. After Maya left, Hartwell stood alone in the hangar, staring at the Apache that had just received unauthorized but undeniably expert maintenance. In the morning, she would request Maya's complete personnel file, including any classified supplements. But tonight, she was left with the growing certainty that Staff Sergeant Maya Chen was far more than she appeared to be. The question was, what was someone with her obvious qualifications doing fueling helicopters at Fort Carson, and why was she working so hard to remain invisible? The answers to those questions would come soon enough, when Brigadier General Marcus Webb arrived for his surprise inspection and caught sight of something Maya had spent 3 weeks keeping hidden, something that would transform her from an anonymous ground crew member into a legend walking among them. But for now, she remained a ghost in plain sight, servicing the very aircraft she had once piloted into the darkest corners of America's secret wars. Carrying her true identity like a burden that grew heavier with each passing day of pretending to be someone she wasn't. The trouble started on a Thursday morning when Lieutenant Derek Hansen arrived at the flight line with an attitude that had been building for weeks. Hansen was 24, fresh out of flight school, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his wings made him invincible. He'd been watching Maya work around his aircraft for days, and something about her quiet competence irritated him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "Hey, fuel girl," he called out as Maya approached his Apache with the refueling truck. The tone was casual, but the disrespect was intentional. "Try not to scratch my bird, yeah? Some of us actually have to fly these things." Maya didn't respond, just began her standard pre-fuel inspection routine. But Hansen wasn't finished. "You know what I don't get?" he continued, loud enough for the other pilots gathering nearby to hear. "Why do they even put women on flight line maintenance? I mean, these machines require strength, technical knowledge. Not really. Domestic skills." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the group. Most of the other pilots looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. Maya continued working, checking fuel connections with the same methodical precision she always displayed. "Cat, got your tongue?" Hansen pressed, moving closer. "Or maybe you just don't understand what I'm saying. English as a second language and all that." Now, Maya did look up, her expression calm but unreadable. "I understand you perfectly, Lieutenant. Is there something specific about the fuel service you need clarification on?" Her voice was steady, professional, but Hansen heard something else in it, a controlled authority that rankled him. Who was this enlisted fuel tech to speak to him with anything approaching confidence? "Yeah, actually there is," he said, his voice hardening. "I need you to bed. Understand that when I'm talking to you, you stop what you're doing and pay attention. Basic military courtesy." The flight line had gone quiet. Other ground crew members had stopped their work to watch the confrontation. Maya straightened slowly, her hands steady at her sides. "My apologies, Lieutenant. I was focused on completing the fuel service safely. Would you prefer I suspend operations while we talk?" The question was perfectly reasonable, but the way she asked it with just enough emphasis on safely made Hansen's face flush red. She was making him look stupid in front of his peers, and they both knew it. "I'd prefer you remember your place," he snapped. "You're ground crew. I'm a pilot. That means when I speak, you listen. When I give instructions, you follow them. Is that clear enough for your domestic skill set?" Chief Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying warning. "Lieutenant, that's enough." But Hansen was committed now, his ego driving him past the point of good judgment. "Is it, Chief? Because I've been watching her for weeks, and I don't think she understands how things work around here. Maybe she needs clearer guidance." He turned back to Maya, his posture aggressive. "Here's some guidance, Sergeant. Real pilots went to flight school. We studied for years, trained on simulators, learned systems inside and out. We didn't just read about helicopters in some manual. So, when we tell you how to service our aircraft, maybe show a little respect for the expertise." Maya nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right, Lieutenant. Proper training is essential for safe operations." Something in her tone made Hansen pause, but his momentum carried him forward. "Good. So, next time." "Tell me," Maya interrupted quietly, "what's the power setting for maximum range cruise in a 64 Delta?" Hansen blinked. "What? Power setting for max range cruise. Basic pilot knowledge, right? Since you studied for years." The flight line had gone completely silent now. Even the distant sound of ground equipment seemed muted. Hansen's face went from red to pale as he realized he'd walked into a trap. That's not. Why would you need to know that?" "I wouldn't," Maya replied calmly. "I'm just ground crew. But since you mentioned expertise." She paused, her eyes never leaving his. 85% torque, 6,600 pounds per hour fuel burn, optimum altitude 4,000 feet density altitude, gives you roughly 300 nautical miles range with standard fuel load. The silence stretched. Hansen stared at her, his mouth slightly open. Every pilot on the flight line was looking between them now, wondering how a fuel technician knew performance specifications that some of them would have had to look up. "How do you?" Hansen started, then stopped. "Know that?" Maya finished. I read a lot. You mentioned the importance of studying systems. I took that advice to heart. Captain Hartwell, who had been watching from the operations tent, walked over slowly. The tension was thick enough to cut, and she could see Hansen struggling between doubling down and backing away. Sergeant Chen, Hartwell said carefully. That's very thorough knowledge for fuel systems maintenance. Yes, ma'am. I believe in understanding the platforms I service. Hard to do the job right if you don't know what the aircraft is supposed to do. Lieutenant Hansen found his voice again, though it came out smaller than before. That still doesn't. I mean, knowing specs from a manual isn't the same as actual flight experience. Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him. You're absolutely right again, Lieutenant. There's a big difference between book learning and hands-on experience. She paused. For instance, did they teach you in flight school about the phenomenon called settling with power? Hansen's eyes widened slightly. Settling with power was an advanced flight concept, a dangerous condition that could occur during certain descent profiles. Yes, but it's not really relevant to. It's when your rate of descent exceeds the rotor system's ability to generate lift. Maya continued conversationally. It's to the system. It's too on a do. Usually happens when you're trying to land in confined areas with high density altitude. The rotor wash recirculates, creates a feedback loop. Very easy to lose control if you don't recognize it early. She gestured toward the Apache behind her. These birds are particularly susceptible because of their weight and rotor disk loading. Standard recovery is to decrease collective, gain forward airspeed, and climb out of your own downwash. But you have to react fast. Once you're fully settled, you might not have enough power to recover. The entire flight line was staring now. What Maya had just described was graduate-level aerodynamics, the kind of knowledge that came from advanced flight training and real-world experience. Hansen looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Where? He whispered. Where did you learn that? Maya's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, Hansen caught a glimpse of something deeper behind her eyes. Something that spoke of experience he couldn't begin to imagine. Books, she said simply. I read a lot of books. But everyone watching knew that wasn't the whole truth. The way she'd explained the phenomenon, the casual familiarity with advanced flight concepts, the precise technical language, it all pointed to first-hand knowledge, not theoretical study. Chief Morrison stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. All right, everyone back to work. We've got birds to prep for afternoon sorties. The crowd began to disperse, but the whispers started immediately. How did the quiet fuel tech know more about Apache flight characteristics than some of their pilots? Where had she really learned those procedures? Lieutenant Hansen stood frozen for another moment, staring at Maya as she calmly returned to her fuel service routine. His humiliation was complete, but, more than that, he was shaken. Everything he thought he knew about the hierarchy on the flight line had just been turned upside down. Lieutenant, Maya called softly as she finished connecting the fuel hose. Your aircraft is ready for pre-flight. She's running clean today, should be a good flight. Hansen nodded numbly and walked toward his helicopter, but the easy confidence he'd worn like armor was gone. In its place was a growing awareness that he had just made a very large mistake with someone he definitely shouldn't have underestimated. As Maya completed the fuel service, Captain Hartwell approached again. Sergeant? A word? They walked a few steps away from the aircraft, out of earshot of the remaining ground crew. That was quite a display of knowledge, Hartwell said carefully. Advanced flight theory isn't typically part of fuel systems training. No, ma'am, Maya agreed. But understanding the mission helps me do my job better. If I know what the aircraft needs to accomplish, I can make sure it's prepared properly. Hartwell studied her face, looking for cracks in the carefully maintained facade. Where did you really learn about settling with power? For a long moment, Maya didn't answer. When she did speak, her voice was quieter, more distant. Sometimes you learn things the hard way, ma'am. when lives depend on getting it right. The answer sent a chill down Hartwell's spine. It wasn't the response of someone who'd read about dangerous flight conditions in a manual. It was the voice of someone who had lived through them, who had felt the aircraft shudder beneath her as physics and engineering battled for control. "Sergeant Chen," Hartwell said slowly, "I think you and I need to have a longer conversation." "Soon." Maya nodded. "Whenever you're ready, ma'am. I'm not going anywhere." But as Hartwell watched her walk back to the refueling truck, she wondered if that was entirely true. Maya moved with the controlled purpose of someone accustomed to operating under scrutiny, someone skilled at remaining invisible while accomplishing objectives others couldn't imagine. The incident with Lieutenant Hansen had cracked the carefully constructed facade, revealing glimpses of expertise that didn't belong to any fuel technician. And Hartwell was beginning to suspect that Maya's presence at Fort Carson wasn't as routine as her paperwork suggested. In fact, as she looked at the patch of fuel-stained concrete where Maya had just delivered a graduate-level lecture on rotorcraft aerodynamics, Hartwell was starting to wonder if anything about Staff Sergeant Maya Chen was routine at all. The change in atmosphere around Maya was immediate and unmistakable. Where once there had been casual dismissal, now there were sideways glances and hushed conversations. The pilots who had witnessed her exchange with Lieutenant Hansen spread the story through the unit like wildfire, and each retelling added new layers of mystery to the quiet fuel technician who somehow knew more about flying than most of them did. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "I'm telling you, there's something off about her," he said during lunch break, keeping his voice low as Maya sat alone at a corner table across the mess hall. "You don't learn that kind of stuff from reading manuals." "Maybe she wanted to be a pilot," suggested Corporal Williams. "Washed out of flight school or something." "Then why not say so?" Rodriguez countered. "Why all the mystery?" Chief Morrison, who had been listening silently, finally spoke up. "Could be medical. Lot of good pilots get grounded for things beyond their control. Vision problems, heart conditions, family hardship. Maybe she doesn't like talking about it." The speculation would have continued, but Maya chose that moment to bus her tray and leave the mess hall. As she walked past their table, every conversation stopped. Not out of hostility, but from a newfound awareness that they were in the presence of someone whose story was far more complex than they'd imagined. Captain Hartwell had spent the previous evening reviewing Maya's service record with new eyes, looking for clues she might have missed. What she found, or rather, what she didn't find, only deepened the mystery. Maya's file was clean, almost suspiciously so. Every assignment was documented, but the descriptions were vague. Special training rotation, technical support assignment, cross-functional operations support. None of it specified exactly what kind of training, support, or operations. For someone with 8 years of service, the lack of concrete detail was unusual. Most personnel files contained specific school dates, unit assignments, deployment locations. Maya's read like a carefully sanitized summary designed to reveal nothing while appearing complete. The breakthrough came 2 days later during what should have been routine maintenance. Maya was performing a scheduled inspection on an Apache that had just returned from a training exercise when she called Chief Morrison over with unusual urgency. "Chief, I need you to look at something," she said, her voice tight with controlled concern. Morrison approached, noting immediately that Maya's demeanor had shifted from her usual calm professionalism to something harder, more focused. She was crouched beside the helicopter's main rotor assembly, examining the blade attachments with intensity that made his stomach tighten. "What have you got?" Maya pointed to a specific bolt on the rotor head, using a flashlight to illuminate the area. "Stress fracture. Hairline, but it's there. Probably started small and propagated during today's flight." Morrison bent down, following her light beam to the indicated component. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, adjusting his angle and squinting in the bright light, he caught a barely visible crack in the metal, so fine it could easily have been missed during standard inspection. "Jesus!" he breathed. How did you even spot that? Wrong reflection pattern, Maya said simply. Metal fractures bend light differently than solid surfaces. You learn to watch for it. Morrison stared at her. In 15 years of aircraft maintenance, he'd never heard anyone describe crack detection in terms of light refraction. It was the kind of advanced knowledge that came from specialized training, the kind given to people whose lives depended on finding problems others might miss. Where exactly did you learn to identify stress fractures by light patterns? Maya's pause was almost imperceptible. Various training programs. The important thing is getting this aircraft grounded before the crack propagates. She was right, of course. A rotor blade attachment failure in flight would be catastrophic. But Morrison filed away her evasion along with the growing list of things about Maya that didn't add up. He called for the aircraft to be red-tagged immediately, removing it from flight status pending detailed inspection. When the full maintenance team arrived to examine the rotor assembly, their findings confirmed Maya's diagnosis. The hairline crack was real, and according to the structural engineer who examined it, the helicopter had been perhaps 1 or 2 flights away from complete failure. She saved lives today, the engineer told Morrison privately. If that attachment had failed in flight, we'd be looking at a crater and 2 body bags. Word of Maya's discovery spread through the unit faster than her aerodynamics lecture had. This wasn't theoretical knowledge, this was a potentially fatal problem identified through expertise that prevented a tragedy. The casual dismissal of her as just ground crew was becoming impossible to maintain. Lieutenant Hansen, still stinging from his public humiliation, approached Maya that afternoon with obvious reluctance. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something closer to bewilderment. Sergeant Chen, he began awkwardly, I mean, what you found today. That could have been my aircraft tomorrow. Maya looked up from the maintenance log she was updating. Good thing we caught it then, sir. Yeah. But... Hansen struggled with the words. How did you know to look for something like that? I mean, that crack wasn't visible during pre-flight inspection. Different inspection criteria, Maya replied. Ground inspection uses different parameters than pre-flight checks. More time, better lighting, specialized equipment. Another careful non-answer, but Hansen was beginning to understand that Maya's evasiveness wasn't rudeness, it was something else entirely. Something that suggested there were aspects of her background she couldn't or wouldn't discuss. Look, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. What I said the other day, how I acted, it was unprofessional. I made assumptions about you that were clearly wrong. Maya nodded. Apology accepted, Lieutenant. We all make assumptions sometimes. Hansen hesitated, then pressed forward. But I have to ask, where did you really learn all this? The flight characteristics, the maintenance procedures, the way you spotted that crack? That's not standard ground crew knowledge. For a moment, Maya's carefully maintained facade seemed to waver. Hansen caught a glimpse of something in her eyes, a weight, a sadness that spoke of experiences she carried alone. Sometimes, she said softly, you learn things because you have to, because people are counting on you to get it right. And there's no room for mistakes. The answer raised more questions than it resolved. But something in her tone warned Hansen not to push further. This wasn't someone avoiding responsibility, this was someone who had carried more responsibility than most people could imagine. As Hansen walked away, Maya returned to her maintenance logs, but her hands were trembling slightly. Each interaction was becoming more dangerous, each demonstration of knowledge harder to explain away. She was walking a tightrope between maintaining her cover and doing her job properly, and the line was getting thinner every day. That evening, Captain Hartwell found Maya working alone in the hangar, performing what appeared to be unauthorized maintenance on an Apache's avionics systems. This time, however, Hartwell didn't announce her presence immediately. Instead, she watched from the shadows, studying Maya's techniques. What she observed was remarkable. Maya moved through the complex electronic systems with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with every component. Her diagnostic process was methodical but efficient, following protocols that weren't in any maintenance manual Hartwell had seen. When Maya paused to examine a particular circuit board, she held it up to the light and rotated it slowly, studying the surface with the same intensity she'd applied to the rotor assembly crack. "Finding problems that aren't supposed to be there?" Hartwell asked, stepping out of the shadows. Maya didn't startle another telling detail. Instead, she looked up calmly, as if she'd been aware of Hartwell's presence all along. "Preventive maintenance, ma'am. These navigation systems have been experiencing intermittent faults during flight. Thought I'd run some diagnostics. Diagnostics that aren't scheduled and using procedures I don't recognize." Maya set down the circuit board carefully. "Ma'am, may I speak freely?" "Please do. These aircraft are going into combat zones. Pilots are trusting their lives to systems that might fail when they need them most. If I can prevent one crash, one casualty, by spending a few extra hours checking components that others might miss." She shrugged. "Seems like time well spent." Hartwell studied Maya's face in the dim hangar lighting. "That sounds like someone speaking from experience with combat operations. I've read the after-action reports, ma'am. Equipment failure in hostile territory usually ends badly." Another deflection, but Hartwell was beginning to read between the lines. Maya's knowledge, her techniques, her obvious familiarity with combat requirements, it all pointed to someone who had been there, who had lived through the scenarios she worked so hard to prevent. "Sergeant Chen," Hartwell said carefully, "I've been reviewing your service record. There are some gaps in your training history that I'm having trouble understanding." Maya's hands stilled on the circuit board. "How so, ma'am?" "Several multi-month periods, listed as special assignment or cross-training rotation. No specifics about location, unit, or type of training. For someone with your obvious expertise, the lack of detail is unusual." The silence stretched between them. Maya seemed to be weighing her response carefully, and Hartwell had the distinct impression that she was standing at some kind of crossroads. "Some assignments require discretion, ma'am," Maya finally said. "I'm sure you understand. Classified assignments. Black operations." Hartwell felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Maya's advanced knowledge, her careful evasions, the way she moved and observed it all, made sense if she'd been involved in special operations work that couldn't be officially acknowledged. "What I don't understand," Hartwell continued, "is why someone with your qualifications is working ground crew at Fort Carson. This seems like a significant step down from wherever you were before." Maya's smile was sad and tired. "Sometimes, ma'am, you take the assignments that let you sleep at night." The answer hit Hartwell like a physical blow. She'd heard similar words from other veterans who had seen too much, done too much, lost too much. Maya wasn't hiding at Fort Carson, she was healing there, trying to find some semblance of normal service after experiences that had left their mark in ways that weren't visible on the surface. But as Hartwell watched Maya carefully reassemble the avionics system with expert precision, she realized that, healing or not, Maya Chen was still the most qualified person on the flight line. Whatever her story, whatever had brought her to this assignment, the unit was incredibly lucky to have her. The question was, how long would it be before someone in authority noticed what Hartwell was seeing? And when that happened, would Maya's carefully constructed anonymity survive the scrutiny? The answer would come sooner than either of them expected, in the form of a surprise inspection that would expose everything Maya had worked so hard to keep hidden. The alarm that shattered the pre-dawn quiet of Fort Carson was not the standard reveille call that Maya had grown accustomed to over her 3 weeks on base. This was different, urgent, insistent, carrying the sharp edge of genuine emergency. She was already awake, as she always was before sunrise, sitting on her narrow bunk reviewing maintenance schedules by flashlight when the klaxon began its wailing cry across the installation. "All flight crews to immediate readiness. All flight crews to immediate readiness. This is not a drill." Maya's blood went cold. She knew that particular sequence of alerts, had heard it echo across military bases in far more dangerous places than Colorado. It meant incoming casualties. It meant lives hanging in the balance. It meant every second counted. She was dressed and moving toward the flight line before the announcement finished repeating. Around her, the base erupted into controlled chaos as pilots and crew members rushed from their quarters, pulling on flight suits and checking equipment with the practiced urgency of people who understood that delay meant death. The operations center was a hive of activity when Maya arrived. Captain Hartwell stood at the central communications console, her face grim as she coordinated with multiple agencies simultaneously. The large, tactical display showed a map of Colorado's mountainous terrain, with a pulsing red marker indicating the source of the emergency. "What's the situation?" Chief Morrison asked, arriving breathless with a cup of coffee still in his hand. "Training exercise went bad up in the Rockies," Hartwell replied without taking her eyes off the display. "Special Forces team conducting high-altitude operations. Helicopter insertion went wrong. Bird went down in a box canyon at 11,000 feet elevation. Crew of 2 plus 6 operators on the ground, surrounded by terrain too rough for ground rescue." Morrison's face paled. "Weather? Deteriorating fast. Snow squall moving in from the west. Visibility dropping by the hour. We've got maybe a 4-hour window before conditions become impossible for any kind of aerial rescue." Maya studied the tactical display from where she stood near the wall, her trained eyes automatically calculating distances, altitudes, and approach vectors. The crash site was in some of the most challenging terrain in North America: jagged peaks, unpredictable winds, weather patterns that could shift from clear to whiteout conditions in minutes. "What assets do we have available?" Lieutenant Hansen asked, his earlier arrogance replaced by professional focus. "That's the problem," Hartwell said grimly. "Our most experienced high-altitude pilots are deployed overseas. The weather's grounded the Air Force rescue helicopters at Peterson. We've got 3 Apaches ready to fly, but the mission profile." She trailed off, clearly struggling with an impossible equation. "Ma'am," interrupted Warrant Officer Rodriguez, "what about civilian mountain rescue? They specialize in this terrain. Already contacted. They can't get close enough with ground teams, and their helicopters don't have the power-to-weight ratio for that altitude with rescue equipment. The air's too thin, the wind's too unpredictable." Maya felt her chest tighten as she processed the situation. 8 men trapped, in conditions that were deteriorating by the hour, with no apparent way to reach them using conventional rescue assets. The kind of mission that required specialized techniques, intimate knowledge of high-altitude flight characteristics, and the willingness to push aircraft and crews beyond normal operational limits. The kind of mission she had flown dozens of times in places whose names would never appear in official records. "What about using the Apaches for reconnaissance?" suggested another pilot. "Get eyes on the situation. Coordinate with ground teams from below?" Hartwell shook her head. "The crash site is in a box canyon with walls rising nearly vertical on 3 sides. To get close enough for meaningful reconnaissance, you'd need to fly a precision approach through a gap barely wider than the rotor disc, in winds that are gusting to 40 knots, at an altitude where these birds are already operating at the edge of their performance envelope." The room fell silent as the first implications sank in. What Hartwell was describing wasn't just dangerous, it was bordering on impossible. The margin for error was so narrow that a single mistake would turn a rescue mission into a multiple casualty disaster. "So what are our options?" Chief Morrison asked quietly. "We're working with regional authorities to coordinate a ground approach from the south," Hartwell replied. But her tone suggested she didn't believe it would work. "Estimated time to reach the crash site is 8 to 10 hours, assuming the weather holds." "Which it won't." Maya closed her eyes, visualizing the terrain from the tactical display. Box canyon at 11,000 feet, vertical walls, single approach vector through a narrow gap. In her mind, she could see the swirling air currents that would be funneling through that canyon, the way the thin air would affect rotor efficiency, the precise power settings and approach angles that would be required to maintain control in such conditions. She had flown missions exactly like this one. In Afghanistan, in places where American forces operated beyond the reach of conventional rescue assets. She had developed techniques for high-altitude, confined area operations that weren't in any manual, learned through trial and error, in environments where mistakes were measured in lives lost. "Ma'am," she said quietly, stepping forward from her position near the wall. Every head in the operations center turned toward her. The room that had been buzzing with urgent conversation fell silent as they realized the fuel technician was about to insert herself into a discussion of advanced tactical aviation. "Yes, Sergeant?" Hartwell said, her voice carefully neutral. Maya took a breath, knowing that her next words would irrevocably shatter the cover she had maintained for 3 weeks. But 8 men were trapped on a mountainside, and she was quite possibly the only person within 1,000 miles who had the knowledge to get them out alive. "The approach you're describing," she said, her voice stronger now. "It's not impossible. Difficult, yes. Dangerous, absolutely. But not impossible." Lieutenant Hansen stared at her in disbelief. "Sergeant, with all due respect, your ground crew. This is a tactical aviation discussion." Maya turned to look at him, and Hansen took an involuntary step backward. The woman looking at him was not the quiet fuel technician he had humiliated earlier that week. This was someone else entirely. Someone whose eyes held depths of experience that made his own training seem like a children's game. "Lieutenant," she said calmly, "I've flown that exact profile before, multiple times, in conditions that make this look like a training exercise." The room erupted in confusion and disbelief. Pilots talked over each other, asking questions that Maya couldn't answer without revealing classified information that could destroy careers and compromise ongoing operations. Captain Hartwell raised her hand for silence, her eyes never leaving Maya's face. When the room quieted, she spoke with the careful precision of someone who suspected she was standing at the edge of something much larger than a routine rescue mission. "Sergeant Chen," she said slowly, "are you telling me that you have experience conducting high-altitude rescue operations in Apache helicopters?" Maya nodded. "Among other platforms. The key is understanding how rotor efficiency degrades with altitude, how to compensate for density-altitude effects on power available versus power required, and how to read terrain-induced turbulence patterns in confined areas." The technical language was precise, professional, and completely beyond what any ground crew member should have known. Maya was speaking the language of advanced tactical aviation, describing concepts that weren't taught outside of specialized flight schools and elite operational units. "Where?" Chief Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you learn to fly missions like that?" Maya met his eyes steadily. "Places that don't appear on maps, Chief. Doing things that don't appear in official records." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Black operations, special activities, the kind of missions that were carried out by people whose very existence was classified, whose successes and failures were buried in archives that most military personnel would never see. "Ma'am," Maya continued, turning back to Hartwell, "if you'll permit me to examine the tactical situation in detail, I believe I can develop an approach profile that will get your people to that crash site safely." Hartwell stared at her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a decision that could define her career. Finally, she gestured toward the tactical display. "Show me." Maya moved to the display with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command authority. As she began analyzing the terrain data, overlaying wind patterns and calculating approach vectors, the room watched in stunned silence. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was every trace of the deferential fuel technician who had spent 3 weeks trying to remain invisible. In her place stood a tactical aviation specialist whose knowledge and confidence commanded immediate respect from everyone in the room. The primary challenge, Maya began, using a laser pointer to indicate specific features on the terrain map, is the combination of altitude effects and confined area turbulence. At 11,000 feet, you're operating well above the Apache's standard service ceiling for heavy load operations. Power available drops dramatically, and rotor efficiency decreases significantly. She traced a path on the display. But if you approach from the northeast, following this ridgeline, you can use ground effect to maintain lift while transitioning into the canyon. The key is maintaining sufficient forward airspeed to prevent settling with power while keeping your descent rate shallow enough to avoid exceeding the aircraft's autorotational capabilities. Lieutenant Hansen, who had been watching with his mouth slightly open, finally found his voice. That's exactly the kind of analysis they teach at the Army Aviation Center's high-altitude course. Advanced mountain flying techniques, Maya nodded, among other places. But how do you? Hansen stopped, clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. I mean, when did you have time to attend that course? Your service record shows continuous ground crew assignments. The question hung in the air, and Maya's pause was just long enough to be noticeable. Around the room, people were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just technical knowledge, but the revelation of a carefully constructed cover identity. Some training doesn't appear in standard personnel files, Maya said finally, especially when the missions it prepares you for don't officially exist. Captain Hartwell stepped closer to the display, studying the approach profile Maya had outlined. This flight path, it would require precision flying at the absolute limits of the aircraft's performance envelope. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and you'd be looking at a controlled crash at best. Yes, ma'am, Maya agreed, which is why it requires a pilot with specific training and experience in this type of operation. And you're suggesting that you have that training and experience? Maya turned to face Hartwell directly. Ma'am, I'm suggesting that 8 men are going to die on that mountain unless someone with the right qualifications takes an Apache up there to get them. And right now, I may be the only person within range who has those qualifications. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Everyone in the room understood what Maya was saying, but the bureaucratic and procedural obstacles seemed insurmountable. She wasn't rated as a pilot on any current flight status. Her official position was ground crew. The legal and regulatory issues alone could end careers. But outside, the weather was deteriorating, and 8 Americans were trapped in conditions that were growing more deadly with each passing hour. Chief Morrison spoke first. Ma'am, he said to Hartwell, I've been maintaining helicopters for 15 years. I've watched this woman work for 3 weeks, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that she knows these aircraft better than most pilots I've served with. If she says she can fly that mission, I believe her. Other voices began to join in. Mechanics who had watched Maya demonstrate impossible levels of technical knowledge. Pilots who had witnessed her identify problems and explain procedures that exceeded their own training. One by one, the people who had worked alongside her for 3 weeks offered their support for what should have been an unthinkable proposition. Lieutenant Hansen, still visibly struggling with the cognitive dissonance of everything he thought he knew being turned upside down, finally spoke. Sergeant, or whoever you really are, if you can really fly that mission, then those guys up there deserve to have you try. Maya nodded, her expression grave with the weight of what was being proposed. I can fly it, Lieutenant. But I need to be completely honest about the risks. This isn't a routine rescue operation. The margins are tight, the weather is marginal, and if something goes wrong up there, it goes wrong fast and final. Hartwell studied Maya's face, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. What she saw instead was the calm confidence of someone who had faced impossible odds before and survived them. What do you need? Hartwell asked simply. Maya straightened, and for the first time since arriving at Fort Carson, she allowed her true authority to show. I need an Apache configured for high-altitude operations, minimum fuel load, emergency medical equipment, survival gear. I need a co-pilot who can handle navigation and communications while I focus on flying. And I need everyone in this room to understand that what happens next stays classified until further notice. The room buzzed with activity, as Maya's requirements were acknowledged and preparations began. But as the immediate crisis planning took precedence, several people noticed something that would become significant very soon. Maya had unconsciously shifted from asking permission to giving orders, and everyone had instinctively begun following them. The quiet fuel technician was gone, replaced by someone accustomed to command authority in situations where lives hung in the balance. And as word of the developing rescue mission spread through the base, more and more people began to understand that Staff Sergeant Maya Chen was not who she appeared to be. The transformation in Maya was so complete that it took several minutes for the full implications to register with everyone in the operations center. She had gone from deferential ground crew to mission commander with such natural authority that the transition felt inevitable rather than shocking. People who had dismissed her for weeks now found themselves automatically deferring to her expertise as she coordinated preparations for what everyone understood was an extremely dangerous rescue mission. "I'll need the Apache configured with minimum internal fuel, just enough for the mission plus reserves," Maya continued, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to briefing complex operations under time pressure. "External tanks off, emergency medical kit, survival equipment for 8 additional personnel, and rescue hoists if we have them available." Chief Morrison, who had been taking notes, looked up with a frown. "Ma'am, I hate to point this out, but you're talking about weight and balance calculations that would put us right at the edge of the aircraft's operational limits. At that altitude, with that load, the aircraft will perform," Maya said with absolute confidence. "I've flown this exact configuration at 13,000 feet density altitude in Afghanistan. The margins are tight, but manageable if you understand how to compensate for the power loss." The casual reference to operations in Afghanistan sent another ripple of shock through the room. Maya had just revealed that not only did she have advanced piloting skills, but she had used them in combat operations at altitudes that exceeded anything normally attempted with Apache helicopters. Lieutenant Hansen, who was still struggling to reconcile everything he thought he knew with what he was witnessing, raised his hand tentatively. Sergeant, if I may ask, what were you doing flying Apaches in Afghanistan? I mean, in what capacity?" Maya's pause was barely noticeable, but those paying close attention caught the moment of calculation as she decided how much truth she could reveal without compromising ongoing operations. "Special activities," she said simply, "supporting units that operate outside conventional parameters." Special activities. The phrase carried enormous weight in military circles, referring to the most classified operations conducted by America's elite forces. The kind of missions that were planned in secure facilities and executed by people whose identities were compartmentalized, even within the special operations community. Captain Hartwell, who had been coordinating rescue preparations while listening to Maya's briefing, stopped what she was doing and turned to face her fully. "Sergeant Chen, are you telling me that you were part of a special activities unit conducting airborne operations in Afghanistan?" "Among other theaters," Maya replied, her tone suggesting that Afghanistan was only one of several locations where she had operated. "The techniques I'm proposing aren't theoretical. They've been tested in operational environments where failure meant a lot more than mission abort." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a physical presence. Maya wasn't just claiming to have advanced flying skills, she was revealing that she had used those skills in combat, under conditions where the stakes were life and death for American forces operating in hostile territory. Warrant Officer Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing from his position near the communications console, suddenly straightened as pieces began clicking into place in his mind. "Wait a minute," he said slowly. "Special activities. High-altitude operations in Afghanistan. Supporting elite units." He turned to stare at Maya with new understanding. "You weren't just a pilot. You were part of the 160th, weren't you? The Night Stalkers." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the room understood the significance of what Rodriguez had just suggested. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, represented the absolute pinnacle of military aviation. They were the pilots who flew the most dangerous missions, who supported the most elite ground forces, who operated in conditions and environments that conventional units couldn't even attempt. Maya's response was carefully neutral. "I've worked with various special operations units over the years." But her refusal to deny Rodriguez's suggestion was as revealing as a direct confirmation would have been. In the world of classified operations, non-denial was often the closest thing to truth that security protocols would allow. Chief Morrison, who had been listening with growing amazement, shook his head slowly. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "No wonder you know these birds so well. You've been flying the missions everyone else just reads about in briefings." Maya turned back to the tactical display, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Chief, what's our timeline for aircraft preparation?" Morrison snapped back to professional focus. "Give me 30 minutes to run the weight and balance calculations and configure the bird." "But ma'am," he hesitated, "if you really are who I think you are, then you know better than anyone how thin these margins are going to be. One mistake up there won't happen," Maya said with quiet certainty. "I didn't survive 8 years of flying impossible missions by making mistakes when it counted." 8 years. Lieutenant Hansen did quick math in his head, thinking about the timeline of special operations in Afghanistan and other global hotspots. Maya would have been flying during some of the most intense periods of combat operations, supporting missions that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in military aviation. "Ma'am," Hansen said hesitantly, "if I may, why are you here? I mean, if you have that level of experience and training, why are you working ground crew at Fort Carson instead of still flying with special operations?" For the first time since the crisis began, Maya's professional composure showed cracks. A shadow crossed her face, and her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she gripped the edge of the tactical display console. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "you reach a point where you've seen enough, done enough, lost enough." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Sometimes you need to step away from the edge and remember what normal service looks like." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and suddenly everyone in the room understood that Maya's presence at Fort Carson wasn't part of some ongoing mission, it was recovery. She had come here to heal from experiences that had taken more from her than anyone could imagine. But now, with 8 lives hanging in the balance, she was being called back to the skills and experiences she had been trying to leave behind. Captain Hartwell approached Maya, her voice gentle but insistent. "Sergeant, I need to ask this directly. Are you currently qualified and certified to pilot military aircraft? Because if we're going to do this, it has to be completely legal and by the book." Maya reached into her pocket and withdrew a small leather folder, opening it to reveal credentials that made several people in the room audibly gasp. Her pilot's license showed ratings for multiple aircraft types, including special certifications that most pilots never saw. But more significantly, the effective date showed that her qualifications were current and active. "I've maintained my flight status," she said simply, "just in case." Hartwell examined the credentials carefully, her eyes widening as she processed what she was seeing. "These ratings, some of these certifications I don't even recognize, and this authority level." She looked up at Maya with new respect. "Sergeant, you're qualified to fly aircraft that most people don't even know exist." Maya took the folder back and returned it to her pocket. "The mountain doesn't care about my qualifications, ma'am. It only cares about whether I can get those men home safely." As preparations for the rescue mission continued, word began to spread throughout the base that something extraordinary was happening on the flight line. The quiet fuel technician was revealing herself to be one of the most qualified pilots anyone had ever encountered, preparing to fly a mission that conventional wisdom said was impossible. Soldiers and airmen who had worked alongside Maya for weeks found themselves looking at her with new eyes, trying to reconcile the humble ground crew member they thought they knew with the elite operator who was emerging before them. And as Maya walked toward the Apache that Chief Morrison was preparing for what might be the most challenging flight of her career, those who watched her go began to understand that they had been in the presence of a legend all along, they just hadn't known it. The quiet fuel technician was gone forever, replaced by someone whose true story was about to be written in the thin air of the Colorado Rockies, where 8 lives depended on skills that had been forged in the secret wars that most Americans would never know about. But before she could climb into that cockpit, before she could prove definitively that she was who people were beginning to suspect she was, Maya would have to face one more revelation. One that would confirm beyond any doubt that Staff Sergeant Maya Chen was not just a Night Stalker pilot, but something even rarer and more legendary than that. The Apache helicopter sat on the tarmac like a metallic predator, its rotor blades drooping in the thin mountain air as Chief Morrison made final preparations for what everyone understood might be the most dangerous rescue mission attempted from Fort Carson in decades. Maya stood beside the Fort aircraft, running through her pre-flight checks with the methodical precision of someone whose life had often depended on catching problems before they became catastrophic failures. But as she moved around the helicopter, inspecting systems and verifying configurations, she was acutely aware that she was no longer invisible. Word of her transformation from ground crew to mission pilot had spread through the base like wildfire, and small groups of personnel had gathered at a respectful distance to watch preparations for a mission that defied conventional operational parameters. Captain Hartwell approached with a clipboard in hand, her expression a mixture of professional concern and barely contained amazement. "Final weight and balance calculations are complete," she reported. "You're going to be operating at 103% of normal gross weight, which puts you in the yellow zone for high-altitude operations." Maya nodded, unsurprised. "Manageable. I've flown heavier loads at higher altitudes, in less favorable conditions." She paused in her inspection of the rescue hoist mechanism. "What's the latest weather report from the crash site?" "Deteriorating as predicted. Visibility is down to a quarter-mile in blowing snow, winds gusting to 45 knots, temperature dropping rapidly. The window for this mission is closing fast." Maya studied the tactical display one more time, mentally rehearsing the approach profile she had developed. The margin for error was razor-thin, but she had flown in worse conditions. The key was maintaining situational awareness and trusting in skills that had been honed through hundreds of hours of operations that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. "Who's my co-pilot?" Maya asked, turning back to Hartwell. "That's been a challenge," Hartwell admitted. "Most of our qualified pilots are either deployed or lack high-altitude certification. Lieutenant Hansen has volunteered, but his experience with this type of operation is limited." Maya considered this. Hansen was young, inexperienced, and had spent most of their previous interactions being dismissive of her abilities. But he was qualified on the aircraft systems, and in the confined space of an Apache cockpit, personal dynamics became secondary to professional competence. "He'll do," Maya decided. "This mission requires precision flying and crisis management. Those are skills you develop through training and experience, not personality." As if summoned by their conversation, Lieutenant Hansen approached with his flight gear, his face a mixture of determination and barely controlled anxiety. The arrogance that had characterized their previous interactions was completely gone, replaced by the sober awareness that he was about to fly with someone whose qualifications exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. "Ma'am," he said to Maya, then caught himself. The usual military protocol seemed inadequate for someone whose true rank and position remained unclear. "I mean, what should I call you?" Maya smiled slightly. "In the cockpit, I'm pilot in command. You're my co-pilot. Everything else can wait until we get those men home safely." Hansen nodded, then hesitated. "I have to ask. I know you've been flying special operations missions, but what's your actual rating? I mean, for someone to develop the kind of expertise you've demonstrated." Maya's pause was brief, but loaded with significance. She looked around at the assembled personnel, many of whom had stopped their work to listen. The moment had arrived when maintaining her cover became impossible, when the truth had to emerge if the mission was going to succeed. My primary rating is Apache pilot in command with Special Operations qualification, she said clearly. Secondary ratings include multi-engine fixed-wing, high-altitude operations, and combat search and rescue. She paused, then added quietly, my call sign was Ghost Rider. The effect of those two words was immediate and profound. Ghost Rider. Anyone with even passing familiarity with special operations, aviation knew that call sign. It belonged to one of the most decorated pilots in the history of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, someone whose missions had become legend within the special operations community. Chief Morrison, who had been checking fuel lines, straightened slowly and turned to stare at Maya. Ghost Rider, he repeated in a whisper. Jesus Christ. You're the Ghost Rider. Maya's expression remained neutral, but her silence was confirmation enough. Around the flight line, people began connecting stories they had heard with the woman standing before them. Ghost Rider had flown some of the most dangerous missions in Afghanistan and other undisclosed locations, supporting operations that saved countless American lives while operating in conditions that conventional aircraft couldn't even attempt. Lieutenant Hansen felt his knees go weak. He had been assigned as co-pilot to someone whose reputation was known throughout military aviation circles, even if her true identity had been classified. Stories of Ghost Rider's missions were told in hushed tones in officer clubs and flight schools, impossible rescues, precision insertions in hostile territory, flights that pushed aircraft beyond their design limits to accomplish missions that others couldn't even conceive. Ma'am, Hansen said, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea, when I said those things before, about women not belonging on flight lines. Maya held up a hand to stop him. Lieutenant, we all make assumptions based on limited information. What matters now is whether you're ready to fly a mission that's going to test every skill you've learned, and probably a few you haven't. Hansen straightened, drawing on reserves of courage he hadn't known he possessed. Yes, ma'am. I'm ready. Captain Hartwell, who had been watching the exchange with growing understanding, stepped forward. Ghost Rider, she said, the call sign carrying weight and respect that rank alone couldn't convey. I need to ask, why the deception? Why work ground crew when you're clearly qualified for much more? Maya's smile was sad and distant. Because Ghost Rider flew her last mission 18 months ago. Too many close calls, too many friends lost, too much weight to carry. She gestured toward the Apache. But sometimes the mission chooses you, regardless of what you thought you left behind. As Maya and Hansen began their final pre-flight preparations, Warrant Officer Rodriguez approached Chief Morrison with a question that had been nagging at him since the identity revelation. Chief, Rodriguez said quietly, if she's really Ghost Rider, then why isn't she still flying with the 160th? I mean, pilots of that caliber don't just transfer to regular units to work ground crew. Morrison, who had been thinking about the same question, shook his head slowly. Sometimes, the best ones burn out. Fastest, he said. Flying missions at that level, with those stakes, for that long, it takes a toll that doesn't show up on medical evaluations. Rodriguez nodded, understanding. They had both seen combat veterans who carried invisible wounds, who needed time and distance to heal from experiences that couldn't be shared with people who hadn't been there. As Maya completed her walk-around inspection, she noticed Brigadier General Marcus Webb's staff car approaching the flight line. Her stomach tightened. Webb was the base commander, and his unexpected arrival could complicate an already complex situation. If he decided to intervene, if he determined that the bureaucratic risks outweighed the humanitarian necessity, the rescue mission could be canceled before it began. The general climbed out of his vehicle with the deliberate movements of someone accustomed to command authority. He was a tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of war to be impressed. by anything short of exceptional competence. As he approached the Apache, his gaze fixed on Maya with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Captain Hartwell," Webb said, without taking his eyes off Maya, "explain to me why I'm hearing that we're launching an unauthorized rescue mission with a ground crew technician as pilot in command." Hartwell straightened to attention. "Sir, Sergeant Chen has revealed that she possesses advanced pilot qualifications and experience with high-altitude rescue operations. Given the time constraints and the lack of other qualified personnel, she represents our best option for reaching the crash site." Webb studied Maya carefully, noting the way she carried herself, the confidence in her posture, the calm focus that spoke of someone accustomed to operating under extreme pressure. "Sergeant Chen," he said slowly, "I'm told you claim to have special operations flying experience. That's a serious claim to make." Maya met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. I've maintained my flight qualifications and am prepared to execute this mission within acceptable risk parameters." There was something in her voice, a quality of absolute certainty that made Webb pause. He had commanded enough elite units to recognize the difference between confidence and competence, between someone making claims and someone stating facts. "What's your call sign, Sergeant?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maya knew that her answer would either end her cover forever or doom 8 men to die on a mountainside. There was no middle ground, no partial truth that would satisfy a general who was clearly testing her credibility. "Ghost Rider, sir," she said, clearly. Webb's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His eyes widened, his posture shifted, and for a moment the composed general facade cracked to reveal genuine shock. Ghost Rider wasn't just a call sign, it was a legend within the Special Operations community, representing the kind of pilot whose skills and accomplishments were known at the highest levels of military command. "Major Maya Chen," Webb said slowly, using her correct rank for the first time since she had arrived at Fort Carson. "I should have recognized you despite the unconventional circumstances." "Major." The word rippled through the assembled personnel like an electric shock. Maya wasn't just an experienced pilot, she was a field-grade officer whose true rank was 3 levels above what her uniform indicated. Webb approached her with new respect, his entire demeanor transformed by the recognition of who he was really speaking to. "Major, your presence at Fort Carson was unexpected, but given the current situation, perhaps providential." Maya nodded. "General, 8 men are trapped in conditions that are deteriorating rapidly. With your permission, I'd like to go get them." Webb studied the tactical display, reviewing the approach profile Maya had developed. His expression was grave as he processed the risks and complexities of what she was proposing. "Major, this mission is at the absolute edge of what's survivable. The weather, the altitude, the terrain, any one of those factors would make this dangerous. All 3 together." He shook his head. "I can't order you to fly this." Maya's smile was quiet but determined. "You're not ordering me, sir. I'm volunteering." Webb looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Then Godspeed, Major. Bring them home." As Maya climbed into the Apache's pilot seat, with Lieutenant Hansen settling into the co-pilot position beside her, the base watched in silent respect. The quiet ground crew member was gone forever, replaced by one of the most accomplished combat pilots in American military history. But as the Apache's engine spun up and the rotor blades began to turn, creating the distinctive whop 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 that would carry her toward the most challenging mission of her career, Maya knew that proving her identity was only the beginning. Now, she had to prove that Ghost Rider could still fly miracles when American lives depended on it. The Apache lifted off from Fort Carson's flight line with the distinctive sound that had become synonymous with American special operations, a deep, rhythmic thumping that spoke of precision engineering and deadly capability. But for those watching from the ground, the sound carried additional weight. They were witnessing the return of Ghost Rider, one of the most legendary pilots in military aviation history, emerging from months of self-imposed exile to attempt a mission that conventional wisdom said was impossible. Major Maya Chen, her true rank finally acknowledged, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as the helicopter climbed toward the towering peaks of the Colorado Rockies. In the co-pilot seat beside her, Lieutenant Hansen monitored systems and coordinates with the focused intensity of someone who understood that he was part of something extraordinary. Altitude, 8,000 feet and climbing, Hansen reported, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Weather update from the crash site shows visibility down to 200 meters, winds gusting to 50 knots from the northwest. Maya adjusted their flight path slightly, compensating for the increasing wind shear as they climbed toward the crash site. Copy that. We'll use the terrain masking to minimize exposure to the worst of the wind until we're ready for final approach. Behind them, the base had transformed into a hive of coordinated activity. General Webb had established a crisis command center in the operations building, with direct communication links to the rescue helicopter and coordination with every available resource. Captain Hartwell monitored weather updates, while Chief Morrison tracked the Apache's mechanical status through telemetry links. But more significantly, word of Maya's true identity had spread throughout Fort Carson with the speed that only military communities could achieve. Soldiers, airmen, and support personnel who had worked alongside the quiet fuel technician for 3 weeks were coming to terms with the reality that they had been in the presence of a living legend. Sergeant Rodriguez stood near the flight line, watching the Apache disappear into the mountains, shaking his head in amazement. "I can't believe it," he said to anyone within earshot. 3 weeks I worked next to Ghost Rider and thought she was just another ground crew transfer. Corporal Williams, who had tried several times to strike up conversations with Maya during meal breaks, felt a mixture of awe and embarrassment. She was so quiet, so normal. I mean, she never acted like she was anyone special. "That's what made her special," Chief Morrison said, joining the group watching the helicopter's departure. "Real heroes don't need to announce themselves. They just do what needs to be done when it matters most." In the Crisis Command Center, General Webb monitored the mission's progress with the tense focus of a commander who understood that success or failure would be measured in lives saved or lost. But as he watched the tactical display showing Maya's aircraft approaching the most dangerous phase of the mission, he was also processing the implications of having one of the military's most classified pilots operating from his base. "Sir," Captain Hartwell said quietly, "I have to ask, how long have you known about Major Chen's real identity?" Webb's smile was grim. "I didn't, Captain. Her presence here was as much a surprise to me as it was to you. But now that I know who she is, a lot of things make more sense. Such as why a simple personnel transfer required security clearances that were above my authorization level. Such as why her service record had more black lines than actual information. Such as why someone thought it was necessary to place one of our most valuable aviation assets in what appeared to be a routine ground crew position." Hartwell frowned. "You think her assignment here was deliberate, not random?" "Nothing involving Ghost Rider is random, Captain. People at her level of classification don't get assigned anywhere without very specific reasons. The question is whether those reasons had anything to do with today's mission." As they spoke, Maya's voice crackled over the radio from the Apache, now approaching the crash site through weather conditions that were deteriorating by the minute. "Base, this is Ghost Rider. I have visual contact with the crash site, confirming 8 personnel on the ground, 1 aircraft down in the canyon floor. Conditions are marginal, but manageable." The clinical precision of her report belied the extreme difficulty of what she was attempting. To maintain visual contact with the crash site meant flying through a narrow canyon in near whiteout conditions, navigating by instruments and intuition through terrain that offered no margin for error. "Roger, Ghost Rider," Webb responded personally. "What's your assessment for extraction feasibility?" "Positive for extraction, but it's going to be tight. The canyon walls are closer than the reconnaissance photos indicated, and the wind patterns are creating significant turbulence. I'll need to hover taxi to a position directly over the survivors. which means operating in ground effect with less than 10 feet of clearance on either side. Everyone in the command center understood what Maya was describing. She would have to position a 60-foot-long helicopter in a space that offered almost no room for error, in weather conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots, while maintaining perfect stability to allow for personnel recovery. Ghost Rider, be advised that weather conditions are expected to worsen significantly within the next 30 minutes. This may be your only opportunity for extraction. Understood, base. Beginning final approach now. The radio fell silent as Maya entered the most dangerous phase of the mission. In the Apache's cockpit, she drew on every technique she had learned during 8 years of flying missions that existed only in classified files. The key was trusting in her training, in her experience, and in the aircraft's capabilities, even when pushed to their absolute limits. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Hansen said quietly, "I can see the survivors. They're signaling with emergency strobes." Maya nodded, adjusting her approach angle to account for the swirling winds that threatened to slam the helicopter into the canyon walls. "I see them, preparing for hover. Monitor our power margins and be ready to call out any drift." What followed was a demonstration of flying skill that would have been remarkable under any circumstances, but became legendary given the conditions Maya was operating in. She positioned the Apache with surgical precision, maintaining a perfect hover in winds that were gusting beyond the aircraft's normal operational limits, while ground personnel below attached survivors to rescue hoists. In the command center at Fort Carson, General Webb watched the mission unfold with the tense focus of someone who understood that he was witnessing history being made. Around him, officers and enlisted personnel who had come to observe were silent with awe as they realized they were watching one of the most challenging rescue missions ever attempted. "Sir," Captain Hartwell whispered, "what she's doing up there, it's impossible." "No," Webb replied quietly. "It's just very, very difficult, which is why there are only a handful of pilots in the world capable of attempting it, and only one currently available to us." The radio crackled again as Maya reported the successful recovery of the first group of survivors. But as she prepared to reposition for the final extraction, the weather took a turn for the worse. "Base, this is Ghost Rider. Visibility is dropping rapidly, and wind shear is increasing. I'm going to have to make the final pickup quickly or abort the mission." The implications were clear. If Maya couldn't complete the extraction on this attempt, the remaining survivors would be trapped until weather conditions improved, which meteorological reports suggested might not happen for days. "Ghost Rider, you are cleared to use your best judgment. Do not exceed safe operational parameters." Maya's response carried the quiet confidence that had made her a legend within special operations circles. "Base, safe operational parameters are whatever it takes to bring Americans home." Beginning final approach. What happened next would be talked about in military aviation circles for years to come. Operating in conditions that exceeded every normal safety limitation, Maya completed the most challenging rescue extraction ever recorded, bringing all 8 survivors to safety through a combination of skill, determination, and the kind of courage that defines the difference between good pilots and legendary ones. As the Apache lifted away from the canyon with all survivors aboard, the radio in Fort Carson's command center exploded with celebration. But for Maya, flying the damaged aircraft back to base through continuing severe weather, the mission wasn't over until everyone was safely on the ground. The Apache touched down on Fort Carson's flight line 47 minutes after beginning the rescue extraction, its rotor blades still turning as medical personnel rushed to attend to the survivors. Maya shut down the engines with the methodical precision of someone for whom post-flight procedures were as automatic as breathing, but her hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline of the mission began to fade. Lieutenant Hansen, who had watched one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of flying skill in his young career, sat in stunned silence as the aircraft systems wound down around them. "Ma'am," he finally managed, "what you just did up there, I've never seen anything like it." Maya's smile was tired but satisfied. "You did good work today, Lieutenant." Navigation and systems management were flawless. That mission succeeds only if everyone does their job perfectly. As they climbed out of the Apache, Maya was surprised to see that the entire flight line had filled with personnel during their absence. What seemed like half the base had gathered to witness the return of the rescue mission, and as she walked away from the aircraft, spontaneous applause began to ripple through the crowd. But Maya's attention was focused on the group of senior officers approaching from the operations center, led by General Webb. Behind him walked several men in civilian clothes, whose presence immediately triggered her operational awareness. The kind of people who appeared at military bases only when something significant had occurred that required oversight from outside normal command channels. "Major Chen," General Webb said as he reached her, his voice carrying formal authority but also unmistakable respect. "Outstanding work today. All 8 survivors are alive and receiving medical attention." "Thank you, sir." Lieutenant Hansen provided excellent support throughout the mission. Webb nodded, then gestured toward the civilians behind him. "Major, I'd like you to meet some people who have been very interested in your activities here at Fort Carson." Maya's stomach tightened. She had expected that revealing her identity would bring scrutiny, but the presence of what were obviously intelligence personnel suggested that her cover had been compromised in ways that went beyond the immediate rescue mission. The lead civilian, a man in his 50s with the kind of unremarkable appearance that was itself remarkable, stepped forward. "Major Chen, or should I say, Ghost Rider. I'm Deputy Director Harrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to talk." Before Maya could respond, the crowd that had gathered to witness the rescue mission's return began to part, making way for someone whose presence commanded immediate attention throughout the base. Lieutenant Colonel Derek Hansen, not the young co-pilot who had just flown with Maya, but his father, a senior officer whose reputation for perfectionism and harsh discipline was known throughout the Army aviation community. Colonel Hansen approached with the rigid bearing of someone accustomed to finding fault in every situation, his eyes fixed on Maya with an expression that mixed disbelief with barely controlled anger. "So," Colonel Hansen said, his voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere like a blade, "this is the woman who has been masquerading as an enlisted technician while operating under false credentials." The crowd fell silent. Maya straightened, recognizing the type of confrontation she had hoped to avoid. Colonel Hansen represented the institutional military mindset that valued protocol and hierarchy above individual accomplishment, the kind of officer who would view her presence at Fort Carson as a violation of proper order regardless of the lives she had just saved. "Sir," Maya replied calmly, "I was assigned to Fort Carson through proper channels with appropriate authorizations." "Authorizations that were classified above the level of the base commander," Colonel Hansen shot back. "Authorizations that allowed you to operate under false identity while having access to sensitive aircraft and equipment." General Webb stepped forward, his own authority evident. "Colonel, Major Chen's actions today saved 8 American lives under conditions that no other available pilot could have handled. Perhaps this discussion should wait for a more appropriate time and place." But Colonel Hansen was committed to his course, his voice rising slightly as his indignation grew. "General, with all due respect, this woman has been operating under false pretenses for weeks. She has violated basic military protocol by concealing her true rank and qualifications. The fact that she possesses advanced flying skills doesn't excuse the deception." Maya felt the weight of hundreds of eyes watching the confrontation unfold. Around the flight line, soldiers and airmen who had worked with her for 3 weeks were witnessing the collision between institutional protocol and extraordinary capability. "Colonel," she said quietly, "my assignment parameters were established by authorities above both our clearance levels. I operated within those parameters until circumstances required otherwise." "Circumstances," Colonel Hansen repeated scornfully. "Is that what you call it when you decide that military protocol doesn't apply to you? When you take it upon yourself to commandeer aircraft and launch unauthorized missions?" The accusation hung in the air, technically accurate but ignoring the context that made it meaningless. Maya had indeed operated outside normal protocols, but in service of a mission that saved lives when conventional approaches would have failed. Deputy Director Harrison, who had been observing the exchange with professional interest, finally intervened. Colonel Hansen, perhaps you're not fully informed about Major Chen's operational status and the authorities under which she has been operating. Colonel Hansen turned his attention to the intelligence official. Then perhaps you'd care to enlighten me about how a major gets to play dress-up as an enlisted technician while conducting unauthorized activities on a military installation. Harrison's smile was cold and professional. Major Chen's assignment to Fort Carson was part of an ongoing counterintelligence operation designed to identify and neutralize security threats within the aviation community. Her cover as ground crew allowed her to observe and assess potential vulnerabilities that conventional oversight might miss. The revelation sent a shock through the assembled crowd. Maya wasn't just a combat pilot taking a break from operational flying. She had been conducting an active intelligence mission while maintaining her cover as a fuel technician. Colonel Hansen's face flushed red as the implications sank in. Are you telling me that she's been investigating my personnel? That this entire assignment was some kind of spy operation? I'm telling you, Harrison replied evenly, that Major Chen has been conducting authorized activities under the direct supervision of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Her mission parameters required maintaining operational security even from base command personnel. Maya remained silent, but her mind was racing. Harrison's explanation was news to her as well. Her assignment to Fort Carson had been presented as recovery time, a chance to step back from operational flying and process the experiences that had taken their toll over 8 years of classified missions. But as she considered Harrison's words, she began to understand that her presence at the base might have served multiple purposes. Her technical expertise would have made her uniquely qualified to identify security vulnerabilities, while her cover as ground crew provided access to aircraft and personnel that conventional investigators couldn't achieve. General Webb, who had been listening with growing understanding, stepped forward. Deputy Director, are you saying that Major Chen's mission here is now complete? Let's just say that today's events have provided all the intelligence we needed to assess potential security concerns at this installation, Harrison replied. Major Chen's cover is obviously no longer viable, which means her assignment parameters will need to be adjusted. Colonel Hansen, still struggling to process the reversal of his assumptions, tried to reassert his authority. Regardless of any intelligence mission, the fact remains that military protocol was violated. Someone needs to be held accountable for the irregularities in this situation. It was then that Chief Master, Sergeant Morrison, stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face set with determination. The senior NCO approached Colonel Hansen with the kind of respect that rank demanded, but his words carried the authority of someone who had served long enough to understand the difference between protocol and purpose. Sir, Morrison said, addressing Colonel Hansen directly, with all due respect, Major Chen has conducted herself with professionalism and competence that exceeded anything I've seen in 15 years of aircraft maintenance. If there were irregularities in her assignment, they resulted in improved safety, better maintenance standards, and ultimately saved 8 American lives today. Other voices began to join in. Soldiers and airmen who had worked with Maya stepped forward to speak in her defense, describing her dedication, her expertise, and her quiet leadership by example. Even Lieutenant Hansen, the younger one, approached to address his father directly. Dad, the younger, Hansen said, his voice carrying new maturity. I flew with Major Chen today. What she accomplished was impossible by any standard training or protocol. She saved those men because she had skills and experience that went beyond anything we learn in normal aviation training. Colonel Hansen looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing support for Maya that went far beyond simple military courtesy. These weren't soldiers following orders or protecting a superior, they were people defending someone who had earned their respect through competence and character. Deputy Director Harrison, recognizing that the confrontation had served its purpose in revealing unit dynamics and loyalties, moved to conclude the discussion. Colonel Hansen, I appreciate your concern for proper protocol. However, Major Chen's actions today and throughout her assignment here have been exemplary. Any irregularities in procedure were authorized at levels that supersede local command authority. As the crowd began to disperse, Colonel Hansen found himself standing alone, his institutional authority challenged by the reality of individual excellence. The woman he had tried to discipline for protocol violations had just demonstrated capabilities that rendered such concerns irrelevant. Maya approached him as others moved away, her expression neutral but not hostile. Colonel, she said quietly, I understand your concerns about protocol and proper procedure. They're valid concerns that help maintain good order and discipline. Hansen looked at her, still struggling with the cognitive dissonance of everything he had witnessed. Then why? Because sometimes, Maya replied, the mission is bigger than the manual. Sometimes, you have to trust that the people above and below you in the chain of command know things you don't, and that the system works even when you can't see all the moving parts. She paused, then added, your son flew an excellent mission today. He has good instincts and solid prostation training. You should be proud of him. As Maya walked away toward the debriefing that awaited her, Colonel Hansen stood on the flight line watching her go. For the first time in a career built on rigid adherence to protocol and procedure, he had encountered something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about how the military should operate. And as he watched the quiet confidence with which Maya moved through a crowd that parted respectfully before her, he began to understand that some people operated by standards that went beyond rank, structure, and regulatory compliance standards that measured success not by adherence to rules, but by the lives saved and missions accomplished when those rules proved insufficient. 3 days after the rescue mission that had revealed her true identity, Major Maya Chen stood in General Webb's office, receiving new orders that would take her far from Fort Carson and back into the world of classified operations she had tried to leave behind. But, as she reviewed the assignment documents, she realized that her time at the base had changed not just her own trajectory, but the entire culture of the aviation unit she was leaving behind. The 160th has requested your immediate return to operational status, General Webb explained. Watching her read through the classified directives, apparently, yesterday's mission reminded certain people in Washington why Ghost Rider was considered an irreplaceable asset. Maya looked up from the papers, her expression thoughtful. Sir, with respect, I thought I had made it clear that I needed time away from operational flying. The reasons for that haven't changed. Perhaps not, Webb agreed. But the military's needs have. What you accomplished 3 days ago flying a rescue mission that conventional wisdom said was impossible reminded everyone that there are some capabilities that can't be replaced by technology or standard training. Maya walked to the office window, looking out at the priest flight line where Apache helicopters were being prepared for another day of training missions. Down there, she could see Chief Morrison supervising maintenance operations with the same attention to detail he had always shown, but now with additional scrutiny that reflected lessons learned from her time among them. General, what's going to happen to the people here, the ones who worked with me during my assignment? Webb smiled. That's an interesting question, Major. Your presence here, even undercover, seems to have had a significant impact on unit standards and performance. Chief Morrison has requested assignment to a Special Operations Aviation Unit. Lieutenant Hansen has applied for advanced flight training. Captain Hartwell has been recommended for accelerated promotion. Maya nodded, unsurprised. She had seen the change in the people around her, as her true identity became known not just in how they viewed her, but in how they viewed themselves and their own potential. And the security issues that Deputy Director Harrison mentioned? Resolved. Webb said simply, it turns out that having one of the military's most experienced pilots observing operations for 3 weeks provided valuable intelligence about aviation security procedures across the Army. Several improvements have been implemented as a result of your observations. Maya turned back to face the general. So, my assignment here was always intended as an intelligence-gathering operation? Webb's expression was carefully neutral. Major, people at your classification level are never assigned anywhere for just one purpose. Whether you were consciously gathering intelligence or simply healing from operational stress, your presence here served multiple objectives. It was a typical military answer, acknowledging reality without providing specifics that might compromise ongoing operations. Maya had operated at classified levels long enough to understand that her assignment to Fort Carson had probably been designed to accomplish several goals simultaneously. Sir, what if I decline the return to operational status? What if I choose to remain in a support role? Webb studied her carefully. Major, you're one of fewer than a dozen pilots in the world with your qualifications and experience. After what happened 3 days ago, the people who make decisions about national security assets are unlikely to accept your preference for reduced responsibility. The answer was what Maya had expected, but it still carried a weight that made her shoulders sag slightly. She had hoped that her time at Fort Carson would provide a permanent escape from the world of classified missions and impossible requirements. Instead, it had reminded everyone, including herself, of capabilities she couldn't simply abandon. A knock at the office door interrupted their conversation. Captain Hartwell entered with several folders in her arms, her expression mixing professional respect with personal concern. Sir, Major Chen's transition documents are ready for signature. Also, the base personnel have prepared something they wanted to present before her departure. Webb gestured for them to proceed to the flight line, where Maya discovered that the entire aviation unit had assembled in formation. As she walked toward the assembled troops, she noticed that their posture reflected a new level of pride and professionalism, the kind of transformation that occurred when people realized they were capable of more than they had previously believed. Chief Morrison stepped forward as the senior NCO representative, carrying a small wooden box. "Ma'am," he said, "the unit wanted to present you with something to acknowledge your service here. Not as Ghost Rider, and not as Major Chen, but as the person who spent 3 weeks showing us what excellence looks like when nobody's watching." He opened the box to reveal a custom unit coin. But unlike the standard commemorative pieces that were commonly exchanged in military units, this one was unique. One side bore the traditional Fort Carson aviation insignia. The other side showed the silhouette of an Apache helicopter with the simple inscription, "Those who serve in silence." "Chief," Maya said, genuinely moved by the gesture, "this is, thank you, all of you." Morrison smiled. "Ma'am, we also wanted you to know that the maintenance standards you established during your time here have been adopted as the new unit protocols. The safety procedures, the inspection techniques, the attention to detail, it's all being incorporated into our regular operations." Maya looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing people whose professional development had been accelerated by exposure to standards they hadn't known were possible. Lieutenant Hansen stood with his unit, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine confidence earned through successfully completing one of the most challenging missions of his young career. "There's something else," Captain Hartwell added, stepping forward with an additional document. "The Army Aviation Center has requested detailed reports on the techniques you used during the rescue mission. Your approach profiles and high-altitude procedures are being incorporated into advanced pilot training curricula." Maya accepted the document, scanning its contents. Her methods, developed through years of classified operations, would now be taught to future generations of military pilots. The knowledge that had once been restricted to special operations units would become part of standard advanced training. "This means," Hartwell continued, "that what you accomplished here will help save lives for years to come. Not just the 8 men you rescued 3 days ago, but everyone who benefits from improved training and procedures." As Maya prepared to leave Fort Carson for her return to classified operations, she realized that her time at the base had accomplished something she hadn't expected. Instead of providing an escape from her legacy as ghostwriter, it had extended that legacy in ways that would outlast any individual mission. The quiet fuel technician who had arrived 3 weeks earlier was gone forever, but the impact of her presence would continue long after her departure. In the maintenance procedures that would prevent future accidents, in the training standards that would prepare pilots for impossible missions, and in the understanding among the unit's personnel that excellence was always possible regardless of circumstances. 1 week later, Major Maya Chen reported to a classified facility where her new assignment would take her back into the world of Special Operations Aviation. But as she prepared for missions that would once again exist only in the most secure archives, she carried with her the knowledge that some forms of service transcended official recognition. The students who would learn from her techniques, the pilots who would survive because of improved procedures, and the ground crews who would maintain aircraft to standards that prevented catastrophic failures. They might never know the name ghostwriter, but they would benefit from the legacy of someone who had served in silence and excellence. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where are you watching from, and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget. At Fort Carson, the Apache helicopters continued their training missions under mountain skies. Their maintenance performed to standards that would have been considered excessive just weeks before. In the hangar where Maya had once worked unrecognized, a small plaque was mounted near the tool crib. Excellence is not a skill, it is an attitude. Chief Morrison, who had been promoted to Senior Master Sergeant and assigned to Special Operations Aviation Support, made sure that every new technician who worked on those aircraft understood that their job wasn't just maintaining machines, it was preserving the capability that allowed heroes to accomplish miracles when lives hung in the balance. And sometimes, late at night when the base was quiet and only the essential personnel remained on duty, those who had worked alongside Ghostwriter during her time among them would look up at the sound of helicopters in the distance and remember that legends don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they just show up, do what needs to be done, and disappear back into the shadows, leaving behind a legacy measured, not in medals or recognition, but in the lives saved and the standards elevated by those who understand that true service requires no audience except one's own conscience. The quiet fuel technician was gone, but the impact of her service would echo through the careers of everyone she had touched. A reminder that heroes often walk among us, unrecognized until the moment when courage and competence converge to create the impossible.